Hey everyone, and welcome back. Tonight, we're going to journey through one of history's most extraordinary stories, the rise and fall of the British Empire. For over 3 centuries, this small island nation ruled nearly a quarter of the world's land and governed almost a third of humanity. It was an empire so vast that the sun never set on its territories, stretching from the frozen shores of Canada to the burning deserts of Australia. But how did a rainy island off the coast of Europe come to dominate the globe? And why did this seemingly invincible empire eventually crumble into dust? Tonight, we'll explore the ambition, the brutality, the genius, and the ultimate hubris of the greatest empire the world has ever known. So settle in, dim the lights, and let me tell you the story of how Britain conquered the world, and why it couldn't hold on to it forever. Every empire begins with a dream, and Britain's dream was born from water. Surrounded by the gray-green seas that both protected and imprisoned it, this small archipelago sat like a fortress off the coast of Europe, close enough to smell the smoke of continental wars, far enough away to watch them burn from a safe distance. In the early 1600s, Britain was hardly the master of anything beyond its own shores. It was a collection of fractured kingdoms, England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, often at war with each other, frequently invaded by foreign armies, economically dependent on selling wool to Dutch merchants. The idea that this rain-soaked, fog-shrouded island would one day rule India, Australia, and half of Africa would have seemed like the fantasy of a madman. But the sea that surrounded Britain was not just a barrier, it was a highway. And the English, perhaps because they had no choice, learned to read that highway better than anyone else in the world. The transformation began with a single moment of defiance. In 1588, when the Spanish Armada, 130 ships carrying 30,000 men, sailed up the English Channel like a floating city of conquest, it seemed unstoppable. Spain was the superpower of the age, master of the Americas, controller of the world's silver mines, the sword arm of Catholic Europe. But the English had something the Spanish didn't expect: desperation married to innovation. Their ships were smaller, faster, more maneuverable. Their captains were pirates turned patriots, men like Francis Drake who had learned to fight by stealing Spanish treasure. When the two fleets met in the narrow waters off the English coast, it wasn't just a battle between navies. It was a clash between two different ways of seeing the world. The Spanish fought like soldiers, trying to board enemy ships and engage in hand-to-hand combat. The English fought like merchants, staying at a distance, using their cannons to pound the enemy into submission. It was the difference between medieval chivalry and modern warfare, between honor and efficiency. When the storms came and scattered the Spanish fleet, the English claimed it was divine intervention. Perhaps it was. Or perhaps it was simply the first sign that the future belonged not to the largest armies, but to the most adaptable minds. The defeat of the Armada was more than a military victory. It was a psychological transformation. For the first time, the English began to see themselves not as a peripheral European kingdom, but as a potential maritime power. The sea, which had once been their prison, became their pathway to the world. Queen Elizabeth I understood this transformation instinctively. She began to encourage English privateers, legalized pirates really, to raid Spanish treasure ships returning from the Americas. Men like Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh became national heroes, bringing home Spanish gold and tales of distant lands ripe for conquest. But it was the establishment of joint stock companies that truly launched the British Empire. These were something new in the world: private corporations with the power to wage war, sign treaties, and govern territories. They were capitalism armed with cannons, commerce backed by conquest. The Muscovy Company, founded in 1555, opened trade with Russia through the frozen Arctic seas. The Levant Company, established in 1592, traded with the Ottoman Empire, bringing back silk and spices from the mysterious East. And in 1600, the most important of all was chartered, the East India Company. The East India Company's motto was simple: trade follows the flag. But in practice, it was often the other way around. The flag followed trade. The company's first voyage to India in 1601 was a modest affair: 4 ships carrying English wool and hoping to return with Indian spices. but it marked the beginning of a relationship that would transform both Britain and India, making one the master of the world and reducing the other to colonial subjugation. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, English colonists were establishing footholds in the New World. Jamestown, founded in 1607, was a disaster. Most of the colonists died of disease and starvation. The settlement survived by the thinnest of margins, sustained by tobacco cultivation and the brutal exploitation of enslaved Africans. The Pilgrims who landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620 were fleeing religious persecution, not seeking empire. But they carried with them something more powerful than armies: the English language, English law, and English ideas about property, government, and individual rights. These ideas would spread across the continent like seeds on the wind, taking root in soil that had never known European civilization. By 1650, England had established colonies in Virginia, Massachusetts, Maryland, and the Caribbean islands of Barbados and Jamaica. These were not yet the jewels of a global empire. They were struggling settlements on the edge of the known world, constantly threatened by disease, starvation, and hostile neighbors. But they represented something unprecedented: the systematic colonization of distant lands by a European power. The Spanish had conquered vast territories in the Americas, but they had done so primarily to extract gold and silver. The English were different. They came to stay, to build new societies, to recreate England in foreign lands. This difference would prove crucial to the empire's eventual success. Spanish colonies remained dependent on the mother country, existing primarily to enrich Spain. English colonies, by contrast, developed their own economies, their own institutions, their own identities. They became extensions of England, not merely possessions of it. The English also proved more adaptable than their rivals. Where the Spanish imposed their culture and religion on conquered peoples, the English were more pragmatic. They were willing to work with local rulers, to adopt local customs when it suited them, to govern indirectly through existing power structures. This pragmatism was born of necessity. England simply didn't have the resources to impose direct rule on vast territories. But it became a source of strength, allowing the English to control far larger areas with far fewer soldiers than their competitors. By the end of the 17th century, the foundations of the British Empire were in place. The Royal Navy was becoming the most powerful fleet in the world. English merchants were trading in every ocean. English colonists were spreading across North America and the Caribbean, and the East India Company was beginning its conquest of India. The stage was set for the greatest expansion in human history. But first, Britain had to become Britain. In 1707, something remarkable happened in the corridors of power in London and Edinburgh. Two ancient enemies, England and Scotland, decided to become one nation. The Act of Union created Great Britain, and with it, the political foundation for the greatest empire the world had ever seen. But this union was not born of love or shared identity. It was born of calculation, desperation, and mutual need. Scotland, bankrupted by a disastrous attempt to establish its own colony in Panama, needed English money. England, facing the prospect of a hostile Scotland allied with France, needed Scottish loyalty. The marriage was arranged like a business transaction, negotiated in smoke-filled rooms by men who understood that sentiment was a luxury they could not afford. Scottish nobles were bribed with English gold. English politicians were promised Scottish support, and the common people of both nations were largely ignored. Yet from this cynical beginning emerged something extraordinary. The union of England and Scotland created a new kind of nation, one that was simultaneously ancient and modern, traditional and innovative, conservative and revolutionary. It was a nation that could draw on the commercial genius of England and the intellectual brilliance of Scotland, the naval traditions of the South, and the military prowess of the North. The Scots, who had been England's enemies for centuries, became the empire's most enthusiastic builders. Scottish engineers built the roads and bridges that connected the empire. Scottish doctors and teachers spread across the colonies, bringing education and medicine to the farthest corners of the world. Scottish soldiers fought in every imperial war, their kilts and bagpipes becoming symbols of British power from the Highlands to the Himalayas. But the Union also created something darker, a sense of racial and cultural superiority that would justify centuries of exploitation and oppression. The British began to see themselves not just as successful, but as inherently superior to other peoples. They were Protestant in a Catholic world, civilized among barbarians, free among slaves. This sense of superiority was reinforced by the Enlightenment, the great intellectual movement that swept through 18th century Britain. Thinkers like Adam Smith, David Hume, and Edmund Burke developed theories about economics, politics, and society that seemed to explain British success and justify British expansion. Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, argued that free trade and competition would naturally lead to prosperity and progress. This became the intellectual foundation for British economic imperialism. The idea that opening global markets to British goods was not just profitable, but morally beneficial to all mankind. Edmund Burke's writings on government and society provided a philosophical justification for British rule over backward peoples. The British, Burke argued, had a duty to govern those who were incapable of governing themselves, to bring civilization to the uncivilized, to impose order on chaos. These ideas were not just academic theories. They became the operating principles of the British Empire. Every conquest was justified as a civilizing mission, every exploitation rationalized as economic development, every act of oppression explained as necessary discipline. But the real engine of British expansion was not philosophy. It was war. The 18th century was an age of almost constant conflict as European powers fought for dominance in Europe, America, and Asia. And in these wars, Britain discovered its greatest advantage: the ability to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously while its enemies were trapped on land. The 7 Years' War, fought from 1756 to 1763, was the first truly global conflict in human history. It was fought on 3 continents and every ocean, from the forests of North America to the plains of India, from the Caribbean islands to the coasts of Africa. In North America, British and colonial forces captured Quebec and Montreal, ending French rule in Canada. The death of General James Wolfe on the Plains of Abraham became the stuff of legend, a young hero dying in the moment of victory, his last words reportedly being, "Now God be praised, I will die in peace." In India, Robert Clive's victory at the Battle of Plassey in 1757 gave the East India Company control of Bengal, the richest province in the subcontinent. It was a battle won not by superior tactics, but by superior corruption. Clive had bribed the enemy's generals to switch sides at the crucial moment. In the Caribbean, British forces captured the French sugar islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique, adding their wealth to the growing imperial treasury. In Africa, British traders established new posts along the coast, feeding the growing demand for enslaved labor in the American colonies. The Peace of Paris in 1763 marked Britain's emergence as the world's dominant power. France ceded Canada and all its North American territories east of the Mississippi. Spain, which had allied with France, gave up Florida. Britain now controlled the eastern half of North America and was the undisputed master of India. But victory came with a price that would ultimately prove fatal to the empire's unity. The war had cost Britain £140 million, more than the government's entire annual revenue. The national debt had doubled, and Parliament was desperate to find new sources of revenue. The obvious solution was to tax the American colonies, which had benefited from British protection during the war. The Stamp Act of 1765 required colonists to pay a tax on all printed materials: newspapers, legal documents, playing cards, even dice. It seemed reasonable to British politicians. The colonists should pay for their own defense. But the colonists saw it differently. They had no representation in Parliament, so how could Parliament tax them? No taxation without representation became the rallying cry of American resistance. What began as a dispute over taxes escalated into a constitutional crisis, then into armed rebellion, and finally into a war for independence that would tear the empire apart. The American Revolution was Britain's first great imperial disaster, but it was also a learning experience. The loss of the 13 colonies was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological shock that forced the British to reconsider their entire approach to empire. The old system of governing colonies through local assemblies and traditional elites had failed. The new system would be based on direct rule, professional administration, and overwhelming military force. The empire that emerged from the ashes of the American Revolution would be more centralized, more efficient, and more ruthless than anything that had come before. But it would also be more fragile, because it would be held together not by shared identity and common interests, but by fear and force alone. In the aftermath of the American Revolution, Britain faced a choice that would define the next century of human history. It could retreat from empire, accepting the loss of America as proof that distant territories were too expensive and dangerous to hold, or it could double down, using the lessons learned from defeat to build an even greater empire. Britain chose empire, but this new empire would be different from what had come before. It would be built not by settlers seeking new homes, but by merchants seeking new markets, not by soldiers conquering territory, but by administrators governing populations, not by the sword alone, but by the ledger book and the steam engine. The East India Company became the laboratory for this new kind of imperialism. What had begun as a trading venture had evolved into something unprecedented in human history, a private corporation that governed more people than lived in all of Europe. The company's employees weren't just merchants, they were soldier administrators, men who fought wars in the morning and balanced ledgers in the afternoon. In India, the company found a subcontinent in chaos. The Mughal Empire, which had once ruled most of India with magnificent splendor, was collapsing like a house built on sand. Local rulers fought each other for territory and influence, while French and English traders competed for commercial advantages. It was a perfect opportunity for ambitious men with flexible morals and superior firepower. Robert Clive embodied this new breed of imperial entrepreneur. A clerk turned soldier, he understood that in the modern world, commerce and conquest were inseparable. At the Battle of Plassey in 1757, Clive's small army of 3,000 men defeated the Nawab of Bengal's force of 50,000. It wasn't superior tactics that won the day. It was superior corruption. Clive had bribed the Nawab's generals to switch sides at the crucial moment. The victory at Plassey gave the East India Company control of Bengal, the richest province in India. Suddenly, a trading company found itself governing 20 million people and collecting taxes from an area larger than Britain itself. The wealth that flowed from Bengal would finance Britain's wars against Napoleon and fund the Industrial Revolution that was transforming the British Isles. But the company's success came at a terrible cost to India. The Bengal famine of 1770 killed 10 million people, 1/3 of the province's population. Company officials, focused on extracting maximum revenue for shareholders in London, had ignored the warning signs of crop failure and continued to demand tax payments even as people starved in the streets. This was the dark heart of the new imperialism, the reduction of human beings to economic units, the treatment of entire civilizations as sources of profit. The company's administrators didn't see themselves as tyrants. They saw themselves as rational managers, applying scientific principles to the business of government. Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General of India, tried to reform the company's administration and reduce the worst abuses. But he was fighting against a system designed for exploitation, not governance. Company employees were paid minimal salaries, but were expected to make their fortunes through private trade and corruption. The result was systematic looting on a scale that beggars imagination. When Hastings returned to London, he was impeached by Parliament for his conduct in India. The trial lasted 7 years and became a national sensation, with Edmund Burke delivering speeches that lasted for days, denouncing the company's crimes against humanity. But Hastings was ultimately acquitted, and the system he had tried to reform continued unchanged. Meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution was transforming Britain into something the world had never seen. A nation that could manufacture goods faster and cheaper than any competitor, then use its naval supremacy to force open markets around the world. It was capitalism armed with gunboats, free trade enforced at the point of a bayonet. Steam engines pumped water from coal mines, allowing deeper excavation and more coal production. Steam-powered textile mills produced cloth faster than armies of hand weavers. Steam locomotives carried goods across the country at unprecedented speed. And steam-powered ships freed Britain from dependence on wind and weather, allowing year-round navigation to every corner of the globe. The transformation was visible everywhere. Manchester, once a sleepy market town, became a roaring industrial city of cotton mills and smoking chimneys. The air was thick with soot, the rivers ran black with industrial waste, and the workers lived in slums that shocked even hardened observers. But the mills ran day and night, producing cloth that undersold traditional craftsmen everywhere. British factories could produce goods so cheaply that they destroyed local industries across the globe. Indian weavers, who had once supplied fine cotton cloth to the world, found themselves unable to compete with machine-made textiles from Manchester. The irony was bitter. Indian cotton was shipped to Britain, manufactured into cloth, then sold back to India at prices that destroyed the local textile industry. This process, extracting raw materials from colonies and selling them back as finished goods, became the foundation of the imperial economy. Australia provided wool, Canada provided timber, the Caribbean provided sugar, and India provided cotton and indigo. All of these materials were processed in British factories and sold around the world at enormous profit. The Royal Navy enforced this system with ruthless efficiency. British warships patrolled every ocean, protecting British merchants and intimidating potential competitors. The Navy's mission was simple: keep the sea lanes open for British trade and closed to everyone else when necessary. The Opium Wars with China perfectly illustrated this system in action. The Chinese Empire, proud and self-sufficient, had little interest in British manufactured goods. The Chinese had silk, tea, and porcelain that Europeans craved, but they saw no need for European products in return. This created a trade imbalance that drained British silver reserves. But British merchants had found one product that Chinese consumers craved: opium, grown in British-controlled India. The drug trade was incredibly profitable. Opium cost almost nothing to produce but sold for enormous sums in Chinese markets. Soon, millions of Chinese were addicted, and silver was flowing out of China to pay for their habit. When the Chinese government tried to ban opium imports to protect its people from addiction, Britain went to war to defend the drug trade. The First Opium War, fought from 1839 to 1842, ended with China forced to cede Hong Kong to Britain and open 5 ports to British trade. The Second Opium War, from 1856 to 1860, forced China to legalize opium imports and open even more ports. It was imperialism at its most cynical, using military force to compel a sovereign nation to accept a trade that was destroying its people. But from the British perspective, it was simply business. Free trade was a moral good, and anyone who opposed it was standing in the way of progress and civilization. The same logic applied everywhere the British flag was planted. In Australia, Aboriginal peoples were driven from their lands to make way for sheep stations. In Canada, Native American tribes were forced onto reservations to clear the way for railways and settlements. In Africa, traditional societies were disrupted to create new markets for British goods and new sources of raw materials. But the British didn't see themselves as conquerors or exploiters. They saw themselves as civilizers, bringing progress and enlightenment to backward peoples. They built railways and telegraphs, established schools and hospitals, imposed law and order on chaotic societies. The fact that these improvements primarily served British interests was, in their minds, beside the point. This was the genius and the tragedy of the British Empire. It was simultaneously destructive and creative, oppressive and modernizing. The same system that impoverished millions also connected them to the global economy. The same administrators who extracted wealth also built infrastructure. The same soldiers who conquered territories also imposed peace between warring communities. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain had achieved something unprecedented in human history. Global dominance based not on military conquest alone, but on economic and technological superiority. The empire was becoming self-sustaining, generating the wealth needed to maintain the armies and navies that protected it. But this dominance was built on a foundation of contradictions that would eventually tear it apart. The more successful the empire became, the more it created the conditions for its own destruction. The education systems it established produced colonial elites who understood both Western ideas and local grievances. The economic development it promoted created new classes of people with the resources to organize resistance. The communications networks it built allowed anti-imperial ideas to spread faster than ever before. The empire was at its zenith, but the forces that would eventually destroy it were already stirring in the shadows. Of all the territories that flew the Union Jack, none was more important to the British imagination than India. It was the jewel in the crown, the source of Britain's wealth and power, the proof of its civilizing mission. But India was also the empire's greatest contradiction, a land of ancient wisdom ruled by foreign merchants, a civilization older than Britain itself, reduced to colonial subjugation. The transformation of India from trading partner to imperial possession was gradual, almost accidental. The East India Company had come to trade, not to conquer. But in a land where political authority was fragmenting, where local rulers fought endless wars for territory and influence, the company found that military power was necessary to protect commercial interests. Each victory led to new responsibilities, new territories to govern, new peoples to control. The company's private army grew from a few hundred European soldiers and Indian sepoys to over 200,000 men. Its territories expanded from a few coastal trading posts to vast provinces containing millions of subjects. By 1850, the company controlled most of the Indian subcontinent either directly or through puppet princes. It was a government masquerading as a business, an empire disguised as a corporation. The company's shareholders in London received dividends from the taxes paid by Indian peasants, while company officials in India grew rich from corruption and private trade. But this system contained the seeds of its own destruction. The company's rule was extractive and exploitative, designed to maximize revenue for shareholders rather than promote the welfare of Indian subjects. Taxes were set at crushing levels, forcing peasants to grow cash crops for export rather than food for local consumption. Traditional industries were destroyed by competition from British manufactured goods. Famines became more frequent and more deadly as the old systems of grain storage and distribution were dismantled. The company also interfered with Indian religious and social customs in ways that created deep resentment. British officials, convinced of their own moral superiority, tried to reform what they saw as barbaric practices. They banned sati, the practice of widow burning. They suppressed thuggee, the ritual murder practiced by certain criminal gangs. They built roads and railways that cut across sacred sites and disrupted traditional pilgrimage routes. These reforms were often genuinely humanitarian, but they were imposed without consultation or consent. To many Indians, they seemed like attacks on their religion and culture, evidence that the British intended to convert them all to Christianity and destroy their ancient way of life. The introduction of the Enfield rifle in 1857 provided the spark that ignited this accumulated resentment. The new rifle cartridges were rumored to be greased with cow and pig fat, offensive to both Hindu and Muslim religious beliefs. When Indian soldiers were ordered to bite the cartridges to load their rifles, many refused. What began as a military mutiny quickly spread to become a general uprising against British rule. The rebels proclaimed the restoration of the Mughal Empire and called for the expulsion of all foreigners. For over a year, much of northern India was in revolt. British women and children were massacred at Cawnpore. The siege of Delhi lasted for months. The siege of Lucknow became an epic of imperial heroism and horror. The British response was savage beyond belief. Entire villages suspected of supporting the rebellion were burned to the ground. Rebels were blown from cannons or hanged from trees. The retribution was so brutal that it shocked even some British observers. General Neil's proclamation was typical. "The punishment I inflict is death, and I spare none." But the rebellion also revealed the strength of British rule. The majority of Indian soldiers remained loyal to the company. The princely states that had treaties with Britain mostly stayed neutral or actively supported the British. The rebellion was confined to northern India. The south and west remained quiet. When the rebellion was finally crushed, the British government decided that the East India Company could no longer be trusted to govern India. The Government of India Act of 1858 transferred control of India from the company to the crown. Queen Victoria became Empress of India, and the subcontinent became the jewel in the imperial crown. The new system of government was more centralized and more efficient than the company's rule, but it was also more distant and more authoritarian. The Indian civil service, recruited through competitive examination, provided professional administration. The Indian Army, reorganized with more British officers and fewer Indian soldiers, provided security. The railway system, expanded rapidly after the rebellion, provided both economic development and military control. But the new Raj also created new problems. The civil service, though professional, was almost entirely British. Indians were excluded from senior positions in their own government. The army, though effective, was an army of occupation, designed to prevent rebellion rather than defend against foreign invasion. The railways, though economically beneficial, were built primarily to serve British strategic and commercial interests. Most importantly, the Raj created a new class of educated Indians who understood both Western ideas and Indian grievances. The universities established by the British produced lawyers, doctors, teachers, and journalists who could articulate Indian nationalism in terms that the British themselves had taught them. Men like Dadabhai Naoroji used British economic theories to demonstrate that British rule was impoverishing India. They calculated that Britain was draining wealth from India at a rate of millions of pounds per year, leaving the subcontinent poorer despite its natural resources and industrious population. Others, like Bal Gangadhar Tilak, used British ideas about democracy and self-government to argue that Indians had a right to rule themselves. If the British believed in representative government, why shouldn't Indians have representatives in their own government? The Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, initially sought only modest reforms within the imperial system. Its early leaders were moderate men who believed that gradual progress was possible through constitutional means. They petitioned for more Indian representation in government, for more Indian officers in the army, for protection of Indian industries from British competition. But the British response was largely negative. The Raj was not interested in sharing power with Indians, even educated Indians who had adopted British values and methods. The government's attitude was summed up by Lord Curzon, Viceroy of India from 1899 to 1905. The Congress is tottering to its fall, and one of my great ambitions while in India is to assist it to a peaceful demise. This attitude was self-defeating. By refusing to accommodate moderate Indian nationalism, the British ensured that it would become more radical. By treating all Indians as subjects rather than citizens, they created a common identity among peoples who had previously seen themselves as Bengalis, Marathas, or Tamils rather than Indians. The partition of Bengal in 1905 was a turning point. Curzon divided the province for administrative reasons, but Indians saw it as a deliberate attempt to weaken Bengali nationalism by separating Hindus and Muslims. The response was unprecedented, a boycott of British goods that spread across India, accompanied by the first serious terrorist campaign against British rule. The Swadeshi movement, which promoted Indian-made goods over British imports, showed that Indians could organize effective economic resistance. The terrorist attacks, though limited in scope, demonstrated that some Indians were willing to use violence against British rule. The British were forced to reverse the partition in 1911, but the damage was done. Indian nationalism had been radicalized. The First World War would complete this transformation. India contributed enormously to the British war effort. Over 1 million Indian soldiers served overseas, and the Indian government provided hundreds of millions of pounds in loans and supplies. Indians were told that they were fighting for freedom and democracy, that their loyalty would be rewarded with self-government. But when the war ended, the promised reforms were minimal. The Government of India Act of 1919 gave Indians a limited role in provincial government, but kept real power in British hands. Worse, the Rowlatt Acts of 1919 gave the government emergency powers to arrest and detain Indians without trial. The response was the emergence of Mahatma Gandhi as the leader of Indian nationalism. Gandhi's genius was to combine Western ideas about civil disobedience with Indian traditions of nonviolence and self-sacrifice. His methods were revolutionary, but his goals were conservative. He wanted to purify Indian society as much as to expel British rule. The non-cooperation movement of 1920 to 1922 saw millions of Indians withdraw from British institutions. Students left government schools, lawyers boycotted British courts, voters refused to participate in elections. It was the first mass movement in Indian history, and it showed that British rule depended ultimately on Indian cooperation. The British response was confused and contradictory. They alternated between repression and concession, between treating Gandhi as a dangerous revolutionary and as a saintly figure who could be reasoned with. They never understood that Gandhi's power came not from his personal charisma, but from his ability to articulate the aspirations of millions of Indians who had lost faith in British rule. By the 1920s, it was clear that the Raj was living on borrowed time. The question was not whether India would become independent, but when and how. The British could delay the inevitable through force and cunning, but they could not prevent it. The jewel in the crown was slipping from their grasp, and with it, the foundation of their global empire. By the 1870s, Britain faced a new and terrifying reality: competition. For most of the 19th century, Britain had enjoyed what historians call the imperialism of free trade, the ability to dominate global markets through superior industrial capacity and naval power, without the expense of formal colonization. But now other European powers were catching up, and the comfortable world of British supremacy was crumbling. Germany, unified under Prussian leadership in 1871, was rapidly industrializing and building a powerful navy. France, recovered from its humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, was seeking to restore its prestige through colonial expansion. Russia was pushing south toward India and east toward the Pacific. Even small countries like Belgium were carving out colonial empires in Africa. The result was what historians call the scramble for Africa, the most rapid and complete colonization of a continent in human history. In 1870, Europeans controlled only 10% of Africa. By 1900, they controlled 90%. It was a feeding frenzy of imperial ambition, with European powers grabbing territory as fast as they could survey it. Britain's strategy was to secure the most valuable territories before its competitors could claim them. The Cape Colony in South Africa controlled the sea route to India. Egypt controlled the Suez Canal, the shortcut to the east. Nigeria controlled the palm oil trade. Kenya controlled the headwaters of the Nile. Each territory was a piece in a global puzzle, valuable not just for its own resources but for its strategic position in the imperial system. Cecil Rhodes, the diamond magnate who dreamed of building a railway from Cape Town to Cairo, embodied this new aggressive imperialism. Rhodes believed that British expansion was not just profitable, but morally necessary, that the Anglo-Saxon race had a duty to civilize the world, and that more territory under British rule meant more happiness for humanity. The British South Africa Company, chartered in 1889, was Rhodes's vehicle for expansion. Like the old East India Company, it was a private corporation with governmental powers, the right to make treaties, maintain armies, and administer territories. The company conquered what would become Rhodesia, adding 500,000 square miles to the empire. But the scramble for Africa brought Britain into conflict with both European powers and African peoples who had no intention of being colonized. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 attempted to regulate the partition of Africa, but it was really just a way for European powers to divide up the continent without fighting each other. The conference established the principle of effective occupation, that European claims to African territory had to be backed by actual administration and control. This led to a race to establish trading posts, sign treaties with local chiefs, and plant flags in remote corners of the continent. The Africans themselves were not consulted. They were simply obstacles to be overcome, or allies to be bought. The human cost of this scramble was enormous. The Congo Free State, established by King Leopold of Belgium, became a byword for colonial brutality. The Belgian administration used forced labor to extract rubber and ivory, killing millions of Congolese in the process. The German suppression of the Herero and Nama peoples in southwest Africa was genocide by any definition, wiping out entire ethnic groups. Britain's record was not much better. The conquest of Sudan involved the systematic destruction of the modest state and the massacre of its defenders at the Battle of Omdurman in 1898. Winston Churchill, who participated in the battle as a young cavalry officer, described it as the most signal triumph ever gained by the arms of science over barbarians. The Zulu War of 1879 saw British forces suffer a devastating defeat at Isandlwana before finally crushing Zulu resistance at Ulundi. The war was fought ostensibly to protect British settlers, but its real purpose was to destroy the last independent African kingdom in southern Africa. Most challenging of all were the Boer Wars in South Africa. The Boers, Dutch-speaking farmers who had been in South Africa for 2 centuries, had established independent republics in the Transvaal and Orange Free State. When gold was discovered in the Transvaal in 1886, British interest in the region intensified dramatically. The Second Boer War, fought from 1899 to 1902, was Britain's most difficult colonial conflict. The Boers, fighting on their home territory with superior knowledge of the terrain, proved to be formidable opponents. They used guerrilla tactics that frustrated British attempts at conventional warfare. The British response was to implement a scorched earth policy, burning Boer farms and herding civilians into concentration camps. Over 26,000 Boer women and children died in these camps, mostly from disease and malnutrition. It was a preview of the total warfare that would characterize the 20th century. The war cost Britain £200 million and required 450,000 troops to defeat 60,000 Boer fighters. It was a Pyrrhic victory that damaged Britain's international reputation and revealed the limits of imperial power. The empire could still win wars, but only at enormous cost and with methods that shocked the civilized world. Meanwhile, in Asia, Britain was facing new challenges to its dominance. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 had shortened the route to India, but it had also made the empire more vulnerable to disruption. The canal was controlled by a French company, and France remained Britain's greatest rival in the region. The British response was to buy a controlling stake in the canal company in 1875, using money borrowed from the Rothschild banking house. It was a brilliant coup that gave Britain control of the most important waterway in the world, but it also committed Britain to defending Egypt, which controlled the canal's southern terminus. The Egyptian crisis of 1882 forced Britain to choose between its economic interests and its liberal principles. A nationalist uprising led by Colonel Ahmed Urabi threatened to overthrow the pro-British government and nationalize the canal. Britain could have accepted Egyptian independence, but that would have meant losing control of the route to India. Instead, Britain invaded Egypt and established a veiled protectorate that would last until 1956. The occupation was supposed to be temporary, but temporary occupations have a way of becoming permanent. Egypt became another piece in the imperial puzzle, valuable not for its own sake, but for its strategic position. The same pattern was repeated across the globe. Britain acquired territories not because it wanted them, but because it couldn't afford to let other powers have them. The empire was becoming a victim of its own success, forced to expand to protect what it already had. By 1900, the British Empire covered 11 million square miles and governed 400 million people. It was the largest empire in human history, but it was also increasingly unwieldy and expensive to maintain. The cost of defending so many territories was straining the British economy, while the complexity of governing so many different peoples was overwhelming the imperial administration. More ominously, the empire was creating its own enemies. Every act of expansion generated resistance. Every new territory brought new responsibilities. Every success created new vulnerabilities. The empire that had been built through opportunism and pragmatism was becoming a rigid system that could not adapt to changing circumstances. The scramble for everything had given Britain the world, but it had also given the world reasons to hate Britain. The empire was approaching its zenith, but the forces that would destroy it were already gathering strength. In the mountains and deserts between the Russian and British empires, a different kind of war was being fought. A war of spies and diplomats, of exploration and intrigue, of chess moves played across thousands of miles of some of the most forbidding terrain on Earth. This was the Great Game, the century-long struggle between Britain and Russia for control of Central Asia and influence over the approaches to India. The game began with fear. British officials in India, looking north toward the towering peaks of the Hindu Kush and the Himalayas, saw not natural barriers but highways for invasion. Beyond those mountains lay the vast Russian Empire, expanding southward with what seemed like inexorable momentum. Every Russian advance into the Caucasus, into Central Asia, toward the borders of Afghanistan, was seen as a step toward the ultimate prize, India, the jewel in the British crown. Russian officials, looking south from their new conquests in Central Asia, saw British influence spreading northward from India like a slow poison. British agents were active in Afghanistan, Persia, and Tibet. British gold was financing local rulers who might otherwise have been Russian allies. British maps were charting territories that Russia considered within its sphere of influence. Both empires were driven by the same logic. In a world where great powers competed for global dominance, neutrality was impossible. Every territory that was not under your control was potentially under your enemy's control. Every local ruler who was not your ally was potentially your enemy's ally. The Great Game was not just about territory. It was about the balance of power in Asia and ultimately, the world. The players in this game were extraordinary men. Soldiers, diplomats, explorers, and spies who operated in some of the most dangerous and remote regions on Earth. On the British side, there were men like Alexander Burns, who traveled disguised as a merchant through Afghanistan and Central Asia, mapping territories and assessing the loyalty of local rulers. There was Arthur Connolly, who coined the term Great Game and died horribly in a prison in Bukhara. There was Francis Younghusband, who led a military expedition to Tibet and forced the Dalai Lama to sign a treaty opening the country to British influence. On the Russian side, there were men like Nikolai Przewalski, the explorer who mapped vast areas of Central Asia and Tibet while gathering intelligence for the Russian government. There was Mikhail Skobelev, the general who conquered the Central Asian Khanates with a combination of military brilliance and ruthless brutality. There was Count Nikolai Ignatieff, the diplomat who negotiated treaties that extended Russian influence deep into Asia. These men were playing for the highest stakes imaginable. If Russia could establish a secure route to the Indian Ocean, it would break Britain's naval supremacy and threaten the foundation of the British Empire. If Britain could create a buffer zone of friendly states between Russia and India, it could protect its most valuable possession and maintain its global dominance. Afghanistan became the central battleground of the Great Game. This mountainous tribal country controlled the passes between Central Asia and India. Whoever controlled Afghanistan could threaten the other's empire. But Afghanistan was also one of the most difficult countries in the world to conquer and hold, a graveyard of empires where foreign armies came to die. The First Afghan War, fought from 1839 to 1842, was a disaster for Britain. A British army of 16,000 men was virtually annihilated during the retreat from Kabul, with only one European survivor reaching the safety of British lines. The massacre shocked the British public and demonstrated the limits of imperial power, but the British learned from their mistakes. The Second Afghan War, fought from 1878 to 1880, was more successful. British forces occupied Kabul and forced the Afghan ruler to accept a British resident and British control of Afghan foreign policy. Afghanistan became a buffer state, nominally independent, but effectively under British control. The Great Game was not just fought in Afghanistan. In Persia, British and Russian agents competed for influence over the Shah and his ministers. The country was divided into spheres of influence, with Russia dominant in the north and Britain dominant in the south. The Persian government, caught between two great powers, played them against each other while gradually losing control of its own territory. In Tibet, the British were concerned about Russian influence over the Dalai Lama. The Younghusband expedition of 1903 to 1904 forced its way to Lhasa and compelled the Tibetan government to sign a treaty excluding foreign influence and opening the country to British trade. It was a brutal campaign fought at altitudes where men could barely breathe, but it secured Tibet as a British sphere of influence. The Great Game was also fought through proxies and allies. The British supported the Emir of Afghanistan with money and weapons, while the Russians supported various Central Asian rulers who opposed British expansion. Both empires used local conflicts to advance their own interests, turning regional disputes into episodes in their global rivalry. But the Great Game was ultimately unwinnable. Neither empire could achieve decisive victory without risking a general war that might destroy both. The distances were too great, the terrain too difficult, the local populations too hostile to foreign rule. Both empires were overextended, spending enormous sums to maintain positions that were strategically important but economically worthless. The game began to wind down in the early 20th century as both empires faced new challenges. Russia was weakened by its defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, and by the Revolution of 1905. Britain was increasingly concerned about the rising power of Germany and the need to concentrate its forces closer to home. The Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907 formally ended the Great Game by dividing Persia into spheres of influence and recognizing British paramountcy in Afghanistan. Both empires agreed to respect the independence of Tibet, though this was largely meaningless since neither had the power to control it effectively. The Great Game had lasted for nearly a century and had cost both empires enormous sums of money and thousands of lives. It had brought civilization to some of the most remote regions on Earth, but it had also brought war, exploitation, and cultural destruction. It had demonstrated the global reach of European imperialism, but it had also revealed its limits. Most importantly, the Great Game had shown that the age of easy imperial expansion was ending. The world was filling up with competing empires, and future conflicts would be more dangerous and more destructive than anything that had come before. The British Empire had won the Great Game, but it had also learned that victory in one theater might mean defeat in another. The empire was approaching its moment of maximum extent and maximum vulnerability. The Great Game was over, but the greater game, the struggle for global dominance in the 20th century, was just beginning. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain had become something unprecedented in human history, a nation that could manufacture goods faster and cheaper than any competitor, then use its naval supremacy to force open markets around the world. The smoking chimneys of Manchester and Birmingham had become the engines of empire, producing the wealth that paid for the armies and navies that conquered the globe. The transformation was visible everywhere you looked. The green fields of England were being covered with red brick factories. The clear streams were running black with industrial waste. The ancient rhythms of rural life were being replaced by the mechanical precision of the factory system. Britain was becoming the workshop of the world, and the world was becoming Britain's marketplace. Steam was the driving force of this transformation. Steam engines pumped water from coal mines, allowing deeper excavation and more coal production. Steam-powered textile mills produced cloth faster than armies of hand weavers. Steam locomotives carried goods across the country at unprecedented speed. Steam-powered ships freed Britain from dependence on wind and weather, allowing year-round navigation to every corner of the globe. The statistics were staggering. By 1850, Britain was producing half the world's iron and two-thirds of its coal. British factories were turning out more cotton cloth than the rest of the world combined. British shipyards were building more vessels than all other nations put together. British merchants were trading in every port from Liverpool to Hong Kong. But this industrial supremacy came at a human cost that was almost impossible to calculate. The new factory towns were hellholes of pollution, overcrowding, and disease. Workers labored 14 hours a day in conditions that would have shocked medieval serfs. Children as young as 6 worked in textile mills, their small fingers perfect for tying broken threads. Women worked in match factories, their faces glowing with phosphorus poisoning that would eventually kill them. Friedrich Engels, who would later collaborate with Karl Marx on the Communist Manifesto, described the working-class districts of Manchester as a hell upon earth. The air was thick with smoke and chemical fumes. The streets were open sewers. Entire families lived in single rooms without windows or ventilation. Life expectancy in the industrial cities was half what it was in the countryside. Yet this system of exploitation was also a system of liberation. The factory workers, however miserable their conditions, were free in ways that peasants had never been. They could leave their jobs, move to other cities, organize unions, demand better wages. The industrial system created not just wealth, but also the working class that would eventually challenge the entire structure of capitalist society. The wealth generated by British industry flowed outward through the empire like blood through arteries. Raw materials flowed in from the colonies, cotton from India and America, wool from Australia, timber from Canada, sugar from the Caribbean. These materials were processed in British factories and sold back to the colonies as finished goods at enormous profit. This system of imperial trade was enforced by the Royal Navy, which had become the most powerful fleet in human history. British warships patrolled every ocean, protecting British merchants and intimidating potential competitors. The Navy's mission was simple: keep the sea lanes open for British trade and closed to everyone else when necessary. The Opium Wars with China perfectly illustrated how this system worked in practice. The Chinese Empire, proud and self-sufficient, had little interest in British manufactured goods. The Chinese had silk, tea, and porcelain that Europeans craved, but they saw no need for European products in return. This created a trade imbalance that drained British silver reserves. But British merchants had found one product that Chinese consumers craved: opium grown in British-controlled India. The drug trade was incredibly profitable. Opium cost almost nothing to produce, but sold for enormous sums in Chinese markets. Soon, millions of Chinese were addicted, and silver was flowing out of China to pay for their habit. When the Chinese government tried to ban opium imports to protect its people from addiction, Britain went to war to defend the drug trade. It was imperialism at its most cynical, using military force to compel a sovereign nation to accept a trade that was destroying its people. But from the British perspective, it was simply business. Free trade was a moral good, and anyone who opposed it was standing in the way of progress and civilization. The same logic applied everywhere the British flag was planted. In India, traditional textile industries were destroyed by competition from British machine-made cloth. In Africa, local ironworking was eliminated by cheap British imports. In Latin America, British merchants used their economic power to dominate markets even in countries that were nominally independent. This economic imperialism was often more effective than military conquest. Why spend money on armies and administrators when you could achieve the same result through trade? British goods were simply better and cheaper than local products. British capital could finance railways and telegraphs that opened up new markets. British expertise could modernize backward economies and make them more productive. But this system also created its own contradictions. The more successful British industry became, the more it created competitors. Other countries began to industrialize, using British technology and British capital to build their own factories. Germany, the United States, and Japan were all learning from the British example and beginning to challenge British supremacy. The education systems that Britain established in its colonies produced local elites who understood both Western technology and local conditions. These men could organize resistance to British rule more effectively than traditional leaders who lacked modern knowledge. The railways and telegraphs that Britain built to control its empire also allowed anti-imperial ideas to spread faster than ever before. Most dangerously, British industrial success was creating a new kind of society: urban, literate, politically conscious, that was increasingly difficult to control through traditional methods. The workers who operated the machines that produced the empire's wealth were also learning to organize unions, political parties, and revolutionary movements. By the end of the 19th century, Britain's industrial supremacy was beginning to fade. Other countries were catching up, using newer technology and more efficient methods. The workshop of the world was becoming just one workshop among many. The empire that had been built on industrial dominance would have to find new ways to maintain its global position. But the habits of mind created by a century of industrial supremacy were hard to break. British leaders continued to believe that their country was naturally superior, that their empire was a force for good in the world, that their dominance was both inevitable and beneficial. This confidence would prove to be both their greatest strength and their fatal weakness in the trials that lay ahead. By the dawn of the 20th century, the British Empire had achieved something unprecedented in human history. It governed nearly 400 million people across 11 million square miles, controlling territories on every continent and in every ocean. The sun never set on the Union Jack, and British power seemed as permanent as the tides. But this vast empire was also becoming a burden that was slowly crushing the nation that had created it. The cost of defending so many territories was straining the British economy. The complexity of governing so many different peoples was overwhelming the imperial administration, and the very success of the empire was creating the conditions for its own destruction. The problem was not just one of size, though size was certainly part of it. How do you govern an empire that stretches from the Arctic tundra of Canada to the tropical jungles of Burma, from the sheep stations of Australia to the diamond mines of South Africa? How do you create common policies for peoples as different as Scottish Highlanders and Indian peasants, Canadian lumberjacks and Egyptian fellahin? The British solution was to govern through a complex hierarchy of different systems. Some territories, like Canada and Australia, were self-governing dominions with their own parliaments and prime ministers. Others, like India, were directly ruled by British administrators. Still others, like the princely states of India or the protectorates of Africa, were governed indirectly through local rulers who accepted British oversight. This system worked, after a fashion, but it was incredibly expensive and increasingly difficult to maintain. The Indian civil service required thousands of British administrators, all of whom had to be recruited, trained, transported, and paid. The Indian army required hundreds of thousands of soldiers, both British and Indian, to maintain order and defend the frontiers. The Royal Navy required hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of sailors to patrol the sea lanes and protect British commerce. The financial burden was enormous. By 1900, Britain was spending over 40% of its government budget on defense, most of it for imperial purposes. The cost of the Second Boer War alone, £200 million, was more than the entire annual budget of the British government just 50 years earlier. But the real burden of empire was not financial, it was moral and psychological. The British had convinced themselves that their empire was different from all previous empires, that it was a force for good in the world, a civilizing mission that brought progress and enlightenment to backward peoples. This belief was essential to their self-image as a nation and their justification for ruling over so many others. Yet the reality of imperial rule was often brutal and exploitative. The suppression of the Indian Rebellion in 1857 had involved massacres and atrocities that shocked even hardened soldiers. The conquest of Sudan had culminated in the slaughter of thousands of modest warriors at Omdurman. The concentration camps of the Boer War had killed tens of thousands of women and children. These contradictions created a kind of cognitive dissonance in the British mind. They genuinely believed that they were bringing civilization to the world, yet they were constantly forced to use uncivilized methods to maintain their rule. They proclaimed the benefits of free trade while using military force to open markets. They spoke of the rule of law while governing through emergency powers and martial law. The burden of justifying these contradictions fell heavily on the shoulders of imperial administrators, soldiers, and settlers who had to live with the daily reality of colonial rule. Many of them developed what Rudyard Kipling called the white man's burden, a sense of duty and sacrifice that helped them rationalize their role in the imperial system. Kipling's poem, published in 1899, captured this mentality perfectly. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught, sullen peoples, half devil and half child. This was not cynical propaganda. It was genuine belief. Many British officials truly saw themselves as servants of humanity, sacrificing their own comfort and safety to bring order and progress to chaotic and backward societies. They built railways and hospitals, established schools and courts, imposed peace between warring tribes and communities. But this paternalistic attitude was also deeply racist and condescending. It assumed that non-European peoples were incapable of governing themselves, that they needed British guidance to achieve civilization, that their own cultures and traditions were obstacles to progress rather than valuable inheritances to be preserved. This attitude was reinforced by the pseudo-scientific racism that was popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Social Darwinism suggested that the British had evolved to a higher level of civilization than other races, that their dominance was natural and inevitable. Anthropology and ethnology provided seemingly scientific justification for treating different peoples as fundamentally different and unequal. The result was a system of racial hierarchy that pervaded every aspect of imperial life. In India, British officials lived in separate cantonments, attended separate clubs, and socialized only with other Europeans. In Africa, white settlers were given the best land while Africans were confined to reserves. In Australia, Aboriginal peoples were treated as a dying race whose extinction was both inevitable and desirable. This racial hierarchy was not just a matter of social custom, it was enforced by law. The Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, known as the White Australia Policy, excluded non-European immigrants from Australia. Similar laws in South Africa restricted the movement and rights of the African majority. Even in Britain itself, there were informal but powerful barriers that prevented colonial subjects from achieving full equality. But the empire was also creating the instruments of its own destruction. The education systems established by the British produced colonial elites who understood both Western ideas and local grievances. Men like Mahatma Gandhi in India, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, and Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya were all products of British education who turned that education against British rule. The communications networks built to control the empire, railways, telegraphs, steamship lines, also allowed anti-imperial ideas to spread faster than ever before. Nationalist movements in different colonies could learn from each other, coordinate their activities, and present a united front against imperial rule. Most importantly, the economic development promoted by the empire created new classes of people with the resources and organization to challenge British dominance. Indian merchants and industrialists, African mine workers, Caribbean sugar workers, all of these groups developed their own interests that often conflicted with imperial policy. By the early 20th century, the British Empire was like a vast machine that was running smoothly, but consuming more and more fuel to maintain its operation. The machine was still powerful, still impressive, still capable of crushing any individual challenge to its authority. But it was also becoming increasingly expensive to operate and increasingly difficult to justify. The burden of empire was becoming heavier with each passing year, and the British were beginning to wonder whether the benefits were worth the cost. The empire that had once been a source of strength was becoming a source of weakness, a commitment that Britain could neither abandon nor afford to maintain. The stage was set for the great crisis that would test the empire's strength and reveal its fundamental contradictions. That crisis would come in the form of 2 world wars that would drain Britain's resources and shatter its confidence in its imperial mission. When the guns of August 1914 began to thunder across Europe, few people understood that they were witnessing the beginning of the end of the British Empire. The Great War, as it came to be known, would test the empire's strength as nothing had before, revealing both its remarkable resilience and its fatal weaknesses. At first, the war seemed to demonstrate the empire's unity and power. From every corner of the globe, British subjects rallied to the flag. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa declared war on Germany within days of Britain's declaration. India contributed over 1 million soldiers to the war effort. Even the smallest colonies sent what they could: men, money, and materials for the struggle against the Central Powers. The response was extraordinary. Young men from the wheat fields of Saskatchewan and the sheep stations of New South Wales marched off to fight in the trenches of France and Belgium. Indian regiments served on the Western Front, in Mesopotamia, and in East Africa. South African forces conquered German Southwest Africa. Australian and New Zealand troops landed at Gallipoli in one of the war's most famous and tragic campaigns. But this global mobilization came at a price that would ultimately prove fatal to the empire. The war cost Britain over £37 billion, more than the entire national wealth of the country at the start of the conflict. The national debt increased by over 1,000%. Britain, which had been the world's creditor, became the world's debtor, owing enormous sums to the United States. More importantly, the war shattered the myth of European superiority that had been central to imperial ideology. The civilized nations of Europe had torn each other apart with a savagery that shocked the world. Poison gas, machine guns, and artillery barrages had turned the Western Front into a charnel house where millions died for gains measured in yards. The colonial subjects who had been told that they were fighting for civilization and democracy saw European civilization destroying itself. Indian soldiers who served in France wrote home about the horrors they had witnessed. African porters who carried supplies for British forces in East Africa saw white men killing each other with industrial efficiency. The moral authority of the white race, already questionable, was further undermined by the spectacle of European self-destruction. The war also accelerated political changes that had been building for decades. In India, the contribution to the war effort created expectations of political reform that the British were reluctant to fulfill. The Government of India Act of 1919 gave Indians a limited role in provincial government, but it fell far short of the self-government that many had expected as a reward for their loyalty. The Rowlatt Acts of 1919, which gave the government emergency powers to arrest and detain Indians without trial, seemed to prove that British promises of reform were worthless. The response was the emergence of Mahatma Gandhi as the leader of Indian nationalism with his revolutionary doctrine of nonviolent resistance. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre of April 13, 1919, marked a turning point in British-Indian relations. General Reginald Dyer ordered his troops to fire on an unarmed crowd gathered in a walled garden in Amritsar, killing at least 379 people and wounding over 1,000. Dyer's action was defended by many British officials as necessary to maintain order, but it shocked Indian opinion and destroyed whatever remained of Indian faith in British justice. The massacre revealed the ugly reality behind the rhetoric of imperial benevolence. When faced with a challenge to their authority, the British were prepared to use the same methods as any other imperial power. Overwhelming force applied without mercy or discrimination. The civilizing mission was revealed as a thin veneer over the iron fist of military rule. Similar patterns emerged across the empire. In Ireland, the Easter Rising of 1916 had been suppressed with brutal efficiency, but it had also created a new generation of nationalist martyrs. The execution of the Rising's leaders turned them into heroes and galvanized Irish opinion against British rule. The Irish War of Independence, fought from 1919 to 1921, ended with the partition of Ireland and the creation of the Irish Free State. In Egypt, the Revolution of 1919 forced Britain to grant nominal independence in 1922, though British forces remained to protect the Suez Canal. In Iraq, a major rebellion in 1920 required massive military intervention to suppress. Even in the Dominions there were signs of growing independence. Canada signed the Treaty of Versailles separately from Britain, asserting its right to conduct its own foreign policy. The war had also revealed the empire's strategic vulnerabilities. The German U-boat campaign had nearly succeeded in starving Britain into submission by cutting the sea lanes that connected the empire. The threat to the Suez Canal had shown how easily the route to India could be severed. The Japanese alliance, essential to protecting British interests in the Pacific, was becoming increasingly unreliable as Japan pursued its own imperial ambitions. Most ominously, the war had accelerated the rise of new powers that challenged British dominance. The United States had emerged as the world's leading industrial and financial power. The Soviet Union, despite its internal chaos, represented a new ideological challenge to the imperial system. Japan was becoming the dominant power in East Asia. Germany, though defeated, retained the industrial capacity to challenge Britain again. The British response to these challenges was confused and contradictory. Some officials, like Winston Churchill, believed that the empire could be maintained through force and determination. Others, like the economist John Maynard Keynes, argued that the economic foundations of empire were crumbling and that Britain needed to find new ways to maintain its global influence. The Washington Naval Conference of 1921 to 1922 symbolized Britain's declining position. For the first time in over a century, Britain agreed to naval parity with another power, the United States. The Royal Navy, which had been the foundation of British power for 3 centuries, was no longer supreme. The empire that emerged from the Great War was still vast and powerful, but it was also fundamentally changed. The easy confidence of the Victorian era was gone, replaced by a growing awareness of the empire's limitations and vulnerabilities. The war had been won, but at a cost that called into question whether the empire could survive another such test. The crack in the foundation had appeared, and it would only widen with time. The British Empire had reached its moment of maximum extent. The pink on the map would never be larger than it was in the 1920s. But the forces that would eventually tear it apart were already gathering strength, and the next great crisis would reveal just how fragile the world's greatest empire had become. The 1920s and 30s were the empire's Indian summer, a time of apparent stability and continued expansion that masked the fundamental changes that were slowly undermining British power. On the surface, the empire seemed as strong as ever. The map was still painted pink from Canada to Australia, from India to South Africa. British administrators still governed hundreds of millions of subjects. The Royal Navy still patrolled the world's oceans, but beneath this facade of strength, the empire was slowly dying. The economic foundations of British power were crumbling. The moral authority that had justified imperial rule was being questioned, and new forces, nationalism, communism, fascism, were challenging the entire imperial system. The economic crisis was the most immediate threat. The Great War had transformed Britain from the world's creditor to the world's debtor. The country owed enormous sums to the United States, and the interest payments alone consumed a significant portion of the government budget. The pound sterling, which had been the world's reserve currency for over a century, was under constant pressure. British industry, which had once dominated global markets, was losing ground to competitors in the United States, Germany, and Japan. The old staple industries, textiles, coal, steel, shipbuilding, were in decline, unable to compete with more modern and efficient producers. Unemployment was chronic, reaching over 3 million during the worst years of the Depression. The empire, which had once been a source of wealth, was becoming an expensive burden. The cost of defending India alone consumed over half of Britain's defense budget. The dominions were increasingly reluctant to contribute to imperial defense, preferring to spend their money on domestic priorities. The colonies, which had once provided captive markets for British goods, were developing their own industries and reducing their dependence on British imports. The political challenges were even more serious. Across the empire, nationalist movements were gaining strength and sophistication. In India, the Indian National Congress had evolved from a moderate organization seeking gradual reform to a mass movement demanding complete independence. Mahatma Gandhi's campaigns of civil disobedience had shown that the Raj could be challenged through nonviolent resistance. The Salt March of 1930 was a masterpiece of political theater. Gandhi's 300-mile walk to the sea to make salt in defiance of the British monopoly captured the world's imagination and demonstrated the moral bankruptcy of imperial rule. How could the British justify arresting an elderly man for making salt from seawater? The Government of India Act of 1935 attempted to address Indian demands through a complex system of provincial autonomy and federal government, but it was too little, too late. The act satisfied neither British conservatives, who saw it as a dangerous concession to Indian nationalism, nor Indian nationalists, who saw it as an attempt to divide and rule. Similar patterns were emerging across the empire. In Burma, the nationalist movement was gaining strength under leaders like Aung San. In Ceylon, the No More Constitution of 1931 granted limited self-government, but failed to satisfy nationalist aspirations. In the Middle East, the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939 challenged British rule in Palestine, while nationalist movements in Egypt and Iraq demanded greater independence. Even in the dominions, there were signs of growing independence. The Balfour Declaration of 1926 recognized the dominions as equals of Britain rather than subordinates, fundamentally changing the nature of the imperial relationship. The Statute of Westminster of 1931 gave the dominions complete legislative independence, effectively ending the legal unity of the empire. The rise of fascism and communism posed new ideological challenges to the imperial system. The Soviet Union offered an alternative model of development that appealed to many colonial subjects, particularly intellectuals and workers who had been excluded from the benefits of imperial rule. Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany challenged British power directly, threatening the Mediterranean route to India and the security of the empire's African territories. The Abyssinian crisis of 1935 revealed the empire's weakness in the face of determined aggression. When Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, Britain was unable to take effective action to stop him. The League of Nations imposed sanctions, but they were ineffective without American and German participation. The crisis demonstrated that Britain could no longer act as the world's policeman without the support of other great powers. The Munich crisis of 1938 showed how far British power had declined. Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement was not just a moral failure, it was a recognition of Britain's inability to fight a major war without allies. The empire that had once been able to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously was now struggling to defend its own homeland. The outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939 marked the beginning of the end for the British Empire. Unlike the First World War, which had been fought primarily in Europe, this was truly a global conflict that would test every aspect of imperial power. The early years of the war were catastrophic for British prestige. The fall of France in June 1940 left Britain standing alone against Nazi Germany. The Battle of Britain saved the homeland from invasion, but it also revealed how vulnerable the empire had become. The Blitz showed that British cities could be bombed with impunity, shattering the myth of invulnerability that had been central to imperial ideology. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 brought the United States into the war, but it also brought Japan into conflict with the British Empire. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 was perhaps the most devastating blow to British prestige in the empire's history. The impregnable fortress fell to a Japanese army that was supposedly inferior to European forces. The surrender of over 100,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops at Singapore shattered the myth of white superiority that had been central to imperial rule. If the British could not defend their own territories against an Asian power, how could they claim to be the natural rulers of Asia? The Japanese conquest of Burma, the Dutch East Indies, and much of the Pacific showed that the age of European imperialism was ending. The old empires were being swept away by new forces that they could not understand or control. The British Empire, which had seemed so permanent and powerful just a few decades earlier, was revealed to be as mortal as any other human institution. The war would ultimately be won, but at a cost that would make the continuation of the empire impossible. The Britain that emerged from the Second World War would be a very different country from the one that had entered it, bankrupt, exhausted, and dependent on American support for its very survival. The twilight of the gods had begun, and there would be no dawn to follow. The Second World War was the British Empire's last great victory, and its final defeat. When the guns fell silent in August 1945, Britain stood among the victors, its flag still flying over vast territories, its prestige apparently intact. But the war had drained the empire's lifeblood, leaving it a hollow shell that would crumble within a generation. The statistics told the story of imperial exhaustion. Britain had spent over £28 billion on the war, more than the entire national wealth of the country in 1939. The national debt had tripled. The country's gold reserves were gone, spent on American weapons and supplies. Britain, which had entered the war as a creditor nation, emerged as the world's largest debtor. More devastating than the financial cost was the human cost. Over 450,000 British and Commonwealth servicemen had died in the war. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble by German bombing. The merchant marine, the lifeline of the empire, had lost over 30,000 men and 4,000 ships to enemy action. But the real damage was psychological. The war had shattered the myth of British invincibility that had been central to imperial rule. The fall of Singapore, the retreat from Burma, the near collapse of the Middle Eastern position, all had shown that the British were not the invincible race they had claimed to be. The colonial subjects who had been told that they were fighting for freedom and democracy took those words seriously. Indian soldiers who had fought in Burma and Italy returned home with new ideas about their rights and capabilities. African soldiers who had served in the Middle East and Far East came back with a broader understanding of the world and their place in it. The war had also accelerated social and political changes that made the old imperial system impossible to maintain. The Labour Party's victory in the 1945 election brought to power men who were skeptical of empire and committed to social reform at home. Clement Attlee, the new prime minister, had long believed that the empire was an expensive anachronism that diverted resources from domestic priorities. The new government faced an impossible choice: maintain the empire or rebuild Britain. The country simply did not have the resources to do both. The decision was made easier by the growing strength of nationalist movements across the empire and the declining strategic value of many imperial territories. India was the first and most important domino to fall. The Indian National Congress and the Muslim League had both supported the war effort, but they had done so on the understanding that independence would follow victory. When the war ended, they were not prepared to wait any longer. The cabinet mission of 1946 attempted to find a formula for Indian unity, but the growing antagonism between Hindus and Muslims made this impossible. The demand for Pakistan, a separate state for the subcontinent's Muslims, could not be ignored. Partition became inevitable, despite its terrible human cost. Lord Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, was given the impossible task of transferring power while maintaining order. The partition of India in August 1947 was accompanied by communal violence that killed over 1 million people and displaced 12 million more. It was a tragic end to the jewel in the crown, but it was also a recognition that the age of empire was over. The loss of India was followed by a cascade of independence movements across the empire. Burma became independent in January 1948, followed by Ceylon in February. Palestine, which had become ungovernable due to the conflict between Jews and Arabs, was handed over to the United Nations in May 1948. The pattern was repeated across Africa and Asia. Ghana became independent in 1957, followed by Nigeria in 1960, Kenya in 1963, and dozens of other territories in the following decades. By the 1970s, the British Empire had been reduced to a handful of small islands and territories that were too small or too remote to achieve viable independence. The process of decolonization was not always peaceful. The Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, the Malayan emergency, the Cyprus crisis, the Suez debacle, all showed that the British were prepared to fight to maintain their empire, but they also showed that such fights were ultimately futile. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was perhaps the most humiliating moment in the empire's decline. When President Nasser of Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain and France launched a military intervention to regain control. The operation was a military success, but a political disaster. The United States and Soviet Union both condemned the intervention, and Britain was forced to withdraw in humiliation. Suez showed that Britain could no longer act as a great power without American support. The special relationship with the United States, which had been forged during the war, became a relationship of dependence rather than partnership. Britain was reduced to being America's junior partner, a role that many found difficult to accept. The economic foundations of empire were also crumbling. The sterling area, which had been the financial backbone of the empire, was undermined by repeated currency crises. The pound was devalued in 1949 and again in 1967. The decision to float the pound in 1972 marked the end of sterling's role as an international reserve currency. British industry, which had once dominated global markets, was losing ground to competitors in Germany, Japan, and the newly industrializing countries of Asia. The old imperial markets were no longer captive. Former colonies were free to trade with whoever offered the best terms. The Commonwealth, which had been intended to maintain economic links between Britain and its former colonies, became little more than a talking shop. By the 1970s, it was clear that the British Empire was finished. The pink on the map had faded to a few scattered dots. The Royal Navy, which had once ruled the waves, was reduced to a coastal defense force. The country that had once governed a quarter of the world's population was struggling to govern itself. The empire's end was not marked by a single dramatic event, but by a gradual recognition that the age of European imperialism was over. The forces that had created the empire, industrial supremacy, naval dominance, technological advantage, had been diffused around the world. Other countries could now do what Britain had once done uniquely well. The reckoning had come, and it was final. The greatest empire in human history had lasted for less than 4 centuries, a brief moment in the long sweep of human history. It had transformed the world, for better and worse, but it had also transformed itself out of existence. The British Empire was dead, but its legacy would live on in the language, laws, and institutions it had spread around the world. The question now was, what would take its place in the global order it had created? Today, if you walk through the streets of London, you can still see the ghosts of empire everywhere. The grand buildings of Whitehall, where the colonial office once governed a quarter of the world. The monuments to imperial heroes in Trafalgar Square and Parliament Square. The museums filled with treasures looted from every corner of the globe. The very names of the streets, India House, Australia House, Canada House, speak of a time when London was the capital of the world. But the empire itself is gone, as vanished as the Roman legions or the Mongol hordes. The pink has faded from the map, replaced by the flags of independent nations. The Royal Navy that once ruled the waves has been reduced to a handful of ships. The country that once governed 400 million people now struggles to govern 67 million. Yet the legacy of empire lives on in ways both visible and invisible, beneficial and harmful. The English language, spread by imperial conquest and commerce, has become the global lingua franca. The legal systems of dozens of countries are based on English common law. The parliamentary democracy pioneered in Westminster has been adopted, with modifications, around the world. The economic system created by the empire, global capitalism based on free trade and the movement of capital, has become the dominant model for human organization. The communications networks built to control the empire have evolved into the internet that connects the world. The scientific and technological advances that gave Britain its imperial advantage have become the common heritage of humanity. But the empire's legacy is not entirely positive. The arbitrary borders drawn by imperial administrators have become sources of conflict from the Middle East to Africa. The racial hierarchies created to justify imperial rule have left deep scars on societies around the world. The economic exploitation that enriched Britain impoverished many of its former colonies, creating patterns of underdevelopment that persist to this day. The partition of India, the creation of Israel, the artificial states of Africa, all bear the mark of imperial decision-making that prioritized British interests over local realities. The consequences of these decisions continue to shape global politics, creating conflicts that have lasted for generations. Perhaps most importantly, the British Empire established the template for modern globalization, the integration of the world economy, the movement of people and ideas across national boundaries, the creation of international institutions. All of these have their roots in the imperial system that Britain created. But the empire also demonstrated the limits of power and the inevitability of change. No matter how dominant an empire becomes, no matter how permanent it seems, it carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. Success breeds complacency, expansion creates overstretch, and the very forces that create empire eventually turn against it. The British learned this lesson the hard way. Their empire collapsed not because of a single catastrophic defeat, but because of a gradual erosion of the foundations of their power. Economic decline, military overstretch, nationalist resistance, and changing global conditions all combined to make the empire unsustainable. The same forces that destroyed the British Empire are at work today. The United States, which inherited Britain's role as the dominant global power, faces many of the same challenges that brought down its predecessor. Economic competition from rising powers, military commitments around the world, domestic political divisions, and changing international norms all threaten American hegemony. China, which suffered under British imperialism for over a century, is now emerging as a potential successor to American dominance. The Belt and Road Initiative, China's ambitious plan to connect Asia, Africa, and Europe through infrastructure investment, bears a striking resemblance to the imperial networks that once connected the British Empire. But the world has changed since the age of European imperialism. The old methods of control, military conquest, economic exploitation, racial hierarchy, are no longer acceptable or effective. Modern empires must be built on different foundations: economic integration, technological innovation, cultural influence, and international cooperation. The British Empire was a product of its time, shaped by the particular circumstances of the 18th and 19th centuries. It could not have existed without the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, and the particular balance of global forces that gave Britain its temporary advantage. That world is gone, and it will not return. The future belongs to different forms of organization, different ways of exercising power, different relationships between peoples and nations. The age of empire is over, but the human drive to create order, to build connections, to exercise influence across vast distances continues. The British Empire was both the greatest achievement and the greatest tragedy of the modern age. It connected the world as never before, spreading ideas, technologies, and institutions that have benefited all humanity. But it also exploited and oppressed millions of people, creating hierarchies of race and nation that have poisoned human relations for generations. Understanding this history is essential for understanding our present world. The global economy, the international system, the patterns of development and underdevelopment that shape our world today, all have their roots in the imperial age. We cannot understand where we are without understanding where we came from. The British Empire is dead, but its ghosts still walk among us. They whisper in the languages we speak, the laws we follow, the institutions we inhabit. They remind us that all human achievements are temporary, that all empires rise and fall, that the only constant in history is change itself. The sun has finally set on the British Empire, but it has risen on a new world that the empire helped to create. Whether that world will be better or worse than what came before remains to be seen. But one thing is certain: the age of empire is over, and the age of something else has begun. The story of the British Empire is the story of human ambition and human folly, of great achievements and terrible crimes, of the rise and fall of civilizations. It is a story that reminds us of both the possibilities and the limitations of human power. In the end, perhaps that is the most important lesson of all, that no empire, no matter how great, is eternal. The British learned this lesson, as the Romans learned it before them, as the Americans may learn it in their turn. Power is temporary, but the human story continues. The British Empire conquered the world, but the world, in the end, conquered the British Empire. And in that conquest, perhaps, lies the seed of a better future for all humanity.